The birdcage sat on the church steps before sunrise. Nora Bell saw it before she saw the paper. It was small, made of bent brass wire. The kind a child might hang in a kitchen window to keep a canary singing through winter. But this cage had no song left in it. Its little door hung broken on one hinge. A few yellow feathers clung to the wire. Inside, the bird lay still. Nora stopped at the bottom step. Juniper Crossing was barely awake. The stage depot lamp still burned low. The blacksmith's chimney had not yet begun smoking. Dust slept in the wagon ruts. Above the church door, the bell rope stirred in the morning wind. But the bell itself did not ring. Something was wrong. Nora had come for her mother's sewing box. Years ago, before fever took her, Lillian Bell had left a small cedar box with Reverend Pike's wife for safekeeping. Thread, needles, a copper thimble, a few folded scraps of cloth with patterns drawn in pencil. Nothing valuable to most people. Everything valuable to Nora. Her father, Hiram Bell, had finally decided the box was sentimental rubbish and told Nora he would collect it and sell the metal pieces if she did not stop asking after it. So Nora had come early. Before him. Before the town could watch. She climbed one step. Then she saw the folded paper tucked beneath the cage. Her name was on it. Not written softly. Not mistaken. Written in dark ink across the top. Marriage consent form. Nora Bell consents to marry Gideon Vale. Ceremony to be completed within 48 hours. The air left her chest. For a moment, she could not hear the wind, the sleeping town, or even her own breath. Gideon Vale was 42 years old. Rich from freight investments. And patient in the way men were patient when they believed time belonged to them. Her father had spoken his name too often lately. At supper. By the stove. In the yard where he thought she could not hear. A practical match. A secure future. A daughter owes her family obedience. Nora had said no. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly enough that Hiram Bell's face had gone flat and quiet. Now, her refusal had been turned into paper. At the bottom of the form sat a black thumbprint. The print was meant to be hers. It was not. Nora knew it immediately. When she was 9. She had reached into her mother's sewing basket and caught her thumb on the sharp rim of the copper thimble. It had left a small crescent scar near the pad of her right thumb. Every real mark she made carried a tiny break in the print. This one did not. This thumbprint was smooth. False. Her hands went cold. If the clerk accepted this paper, Gideon Vale could say she had agreed. If she ran without proof, they would call her a foolish daughter escaping a lawful promise. If she stayed, her father would make sure the paper reached the county register before noon. Nora looked at the broken cage again. A warning. A message. A picture of what happened to small things that tried to leave. She wanted to tear the form into strips. Instead, she folded it carefully and slipped it inside her coat. Her mother had taught her that a bad stitch should not be yanked loose in anger. First, you studied how the thread had been tied. Then you cut the knot where it would matter. Nora reached up and touched the church bell rope. It had been cut halfway through. Frayed by a knife. Then tied back loosely so it would look whole until someone pulled. She took the broken strand and wound it around her fingers. Another piece of proof. Behind her, a wagon creaked somewhere near the depot. Nora turned. At the far end of the street, a man stood beside the stage office. Crouched near the wheel tracks in the mud. He was not looking at her. He was studying the road. One gloved hand hovering over a set of fresh marks. Tall. Dust-coated. Still as a fence post before a storm. A stage line man. Maybe. Or someone following the same paper trail that had just found her. Nora stepped down from the church steps. The false consent form hidden against her ribs. The broken bell cord tight in her fist. She did not know the man's name yet. She did not know he was Elias Cade. She only knew this. By sundown, someone would try to put her future in a register. And this time, Nora Bell intended to reach the clerk first. Nora crossed the street with the bell cord hidden in her glove, and the false consent form pressed flat beneath her coat. The man by the stage office did not look up until her shadow touched the wagon ruts. Then he stood. He was older than she first thought. Somewhere in his mid-30s. With sun-browned skin. A dark coat worn white at the seams. And eyes that did not waste movement. He held a small measuring stick in one hand and a folded paper in the other. "You lose something at the church?" he asked. Nora stopped. "No." "Then you found something." Her hand tightened around the bell cord. "Who are you?" "Elias Cade. Stage line investigator." That is a strange thing to say before breakfast. Strange things usually start before breakfast. He nodded toward the road. "A wagon came through here before dawn. Light load. 2 horses. Stopped at the church. Then the county clerk's office. Then doubled back west." Nora looked toward the clerk's building. Its shutters were still closed. "Did someone go inside?" "No. Not yet. But they meant to." The words settled cold in her stomach. Elias watched her face. "You have paper under your coat." Nora took one step back. "That is none of your business." "No," he said. "Not unless someone plans to use it on my line." "Your line?" 3 forced marriage contracts have passed through stage depots in 2 months. Women with marks they didn't remember making. Fathers. Creditors. Freight men. All swearing it was proper. His eyes moved to her gloved hand. "You want a ticket out of town? Or a table to read what they wrote before they file it?" Nora had been ready for many things. Pity. Suspicion. A man offering to decide for her. She had not been ready for that question. "A ticket might be safer," she said. "Maybe. For a day." "And the table?" "Harder. Public. Better chance of ending it." The depot door opened behind him. A sleepy clerk stepped out. Suspenders crooked. Hair flattened on one side. He stopped when he saw Nora. "Miss Bell." Elias turned slightly. Placing himself between the clerk and the papers in her coat without making a show of it. "Morning." "Stokes," he said. "Open your register." The clerk blinked. "We don't sell tickets this early." Then read early. Nora looked at Elias. "I did not say I wanted." "I know." He stepped away from the door and pointed to the ticket window. "You say it." The choice landed in her hands. That was the first thing he gave her. Not protection. Not orders. A choice with witnesses. Nora walked to the depot counter. "I need a ticket held under my name." "Not bought. Held. One way north." "If I choose to use it." Stokes frowned. "If you choose." "That is what I said." Elias placed a coin on the counter. "Holding fee." Written in her name. The clerk hesitated. Nora removed her glove and put her right hand flat on the counter. The small crescent scar near her thumb caught the morning light. "Write it," she said. Stokes wrote. Nora Bell. Ticket held. Not transferred. Not claimed by guardian. Nora watched every word. Only then did she breathe. Elias picked up the ticket stub and placed it on the counter in front of her. Not into her hand. "No one carries that but you." Nora took it and slid it into her pocket beside the false consent form. "Now what?" she asked. "Now you need a room where no one opens the door for your father." He led her 2 streets over to Edna Lark's boarding house. A narrow building with clean windows and a porch swept before sunrise. Edna herself opened the door before Elias knocked twice. She looked at Nora's face. Her coat. The way her hands stayed near her pocket. Then she looked at Elias. Trouble. Paper trouble. He said. Edna's mouth tightened. Worst kind. She stepped aside. Room upstairs. Door bolt works. Breakfast if she wants it. Silence if she doesn't. Nora looked at the older woman. I can pay. Good. Edna said. Then you will not have to thank me more than once. By mid-morning. Elias took Nora to Martha Pike's dry goods store. Martha was broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and sharp-eyed enough to peel paint from a wall. Elias explained only this. She needs work paid on a board. Not promised in whispers. Martha looked Nora over. Can you count change? Yes. Read invoices? Yes. Carry cloth bolts without whining? I can learn. Martha turned, took a chalkboard from behind the counter, and wrote, Nora Bell. Clerk. Room secured. Wages posted weekly. No debt owed. Then she hung it in the front window. Nora stared at it. Her name. Not on a consent form. Not under someone else's claim. On a wage board. Martha dusted chalk from her hands. There. If any man says you belong to him, he can start by reading that. Outside. The church bell finally rang. Once. The cut rope must have snapped clean. Nora touched the ticket in her pocket and looked toward the clerk's office. They will come, she said. Elias stood beside the window, watching the street. Yes, he said. But now they will have to come where your name is already written straight. By noon. Juniper Crossing had learned Nora Bell was not hiding. That made people nervous. A woman running through alleys could be pitied. A woman behind a counter, with her name chalked in a front window, earning wages in daylight, was harder to explain away. Nora stood inside Martha Pike's dry goods store, folding bolts of calico with the false consent form tucked beneath the lining of her coat. Every time someone came in, their eyes went first to her cheek, then to the wage board. Nora Bell. Clerk. Room secured. Wages posted weekly. No debt owed. Some customers stared too long. Martha charged them full price. Near 2 o'clock. The street changed. Nora felt it before she saw anything. Conversation outside thinned. Hooves slowed. The blacksmith's hammer missed a beat. Then Hiram Bell rode into Juniper Crossing with Gideon Vale beside him. Her father looked exactly as he always did when he intended to sound reasonable in public. Clean shirt. Hat set straight. Face composed. Gideon Vale rode a fine bay horse and wore a gray coat too expensive for the heat. He was not handsome. Not ugly. Simply polished in a way that made every rough thing around him look accused. Martha came to stand beside Nora. You can go out the back, she said. No. Martha glanced at her. Good. Hiram dismounted first. Gideon followed. They entered the store without buying anything. Nora, Hiram said, using the soft voice he saved for witnesses. You have caused quite a worry. I left a house where my name was being put on paper without me. Gideon's eyes narrowed. Just slightly. Hiram Saihat. You are upset. I understand that. No. Nora said. You understand how to sound kind when people are listening. The store went still. A woman near the ribbon shelf stopped pretending to browse. Gideon removed his gloves slowly. Miss Bell. This can be handled quietly. That depends on what you mean by handled. Your father acted in your best interest. My father does not own my thumb. The words landed hard. Hiram's face tightened. Gideon looked toward the window and saw the wage board. His gaze held there too long. You are working here now? He asked. I am. For how long? Gideon asked. Martha answered before Nora could. Long enough to be paid. She is my daughter. Hiram said. She is my clerk. Martha replied. Those are not the same thing. A few people had gathered outside now, drawn by the slow magnetism of trouble. Elias Cade stood across the street near the stage depot, arms at his sides, watching. He did not come rushing in. He did not make himself the center of it. Nora saw him and took steadiness from that. Gideon stepped closer to the counter. A consent form exists. Then read it before the clerk. Nora said, "Let the town hear when I supposedly placed my mark." "That is unnecessary." "No. It is inconvenient." Hiram's public face cracked for one breath. "Enough." Nora looked at him. She had heard that word all her life. Enough had meant silence. Enough had meant obedience. Enough had meant disappear into your room and become easier. "Not today. If you have my consent," she said, "bring it to the county desk. If you have only a paper with a false mark, then do not call me runaway. Call yourself careful with forgery." A murmur moved outside. Gideon's expression cooled. "You are being advised poorly." Nora looked past him to Elias. "No. For the first time, I am being asked to read before I sign." At the mention of reading, Gideon's attention shifted to Elias. Recognition flickered. Not fear exactly. Calculation. "You," Gideon said. "Cade." Elias crossed the street then. Slow and unhurried. "Vale." Hiram looked between them. "You know each other." "From freight roads," Elias said. Gideon's jaw set. "Old roads are best left closed. Only when they were clean," Elias answered. Nora heard the warning beneath the words. So did Gideon. He put his gloves back on. "Very well. If Miss Bell wants public procedure, she will have it. My attorney will file a petition before sunset." Hiram turned toward Nora. "You should have come home when you had the chance." Nora touched the wageboard frame. "I did not leave home," she said. "I left a room where my answer did not matter." Gideon and Hiram walked out together. The crowd parted. Across the street, Elias did not follow them. He came only as far as the doorway and stopped. Nora looked at him. "They will use the paper now," she said. "Yes. And if the clerk accepts it, then we show him a better mark." Nora reached into her pocket and felt the crescent scar on her thumb. For the first time since finding the cage on the church steps, the false paper felt less like a trap and more like evidence. The petition arrived before supper. Sheriff Doyle brought it himself, hat in hand, dust on his boots, discomfort written plainly across his face. He found Nora behind the counter at Martha Pike's dry goods store, measuring brown cloth for a woman who suddenly forgot how much she needed once she saw the sealed paper. "Nora Bell," the sheriff said. "This is notice of a county hearing." Martha took one look at the seal and muttered, "That man works faster than a snake in warm grass." Nora wiped her hands on her apron before accepting it. Her name stood on the first line. Petition to recognize lawful marriage consent and prevent removal of respondent from county jurisdiction. Respondent. Not Nora. Not woman. Not daughter. A word small enough to fit in a court book. She read the petition once. Then again. Gideon Vale claimed she had placed her mark on the consent form willingly. Hiram Bell swore she was confused, impressionable, and under outside influence. The hearing would be held in 2 days at the Stage Depot Hall, because the county judge was passing through Juniper Crossing on his way east. 2 days. Martha took the paper from Nora's hand and read it with a hardening jaw. "They want you cornered before you can breathe." "No," Nora said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "They want me cornered before I can answer." That evening, Gideon Vale came alone. He entered the store after closing, when the lamps were lit and Martha was counting cash behind the counter. Elias Cade had not come in. But Nora knew he was across the street at the depot. She had seen his shadow move past the window twice. Gideon removed his hat. Miss Bell. If you came to buy cloth, Martha has the prices marked. I came to offer cents. Martha did not look up from the cash drawer. We charge extra for that after dark. Gideon ignored her. His gaze stayed on Nora. You can still end this quietly. Appear at the hearing. Say you were frightened. Say you misunderstood your father's intentions. And I will accept the apology. Nora folded the petition and set it on the counter. What does my father have on you? For the first time? Gideon's polite face thinned. I beg your pardon. You heard me? His eyes sharpened. You have been listening to Cade. I have been listening to you. Gideon stepped closer. Your father is trying to save you from a foolish road. No. My father is trying to buy your silence with my life. I want to know why. The store went still. Martha's hand rested near the ledger. But she said nothing. Something moved through Gideon's expression. Not guilt exactly. Fear wearing a clean coat. You are making enemies you do not understand. He said. Then withdraw the petition. His mouth tightened. I thought not. After he left, Elias came in through the side door without knocking. He looked at Nora's face. Then at the petition on the counter. He threatened you. He warned me. That is often the same thing. Nora met his eyes. Tell me about Black Spur. Elias was silent long enough that Martha stopped counting. Then he removed his gloves and laid them on the counter. Black Spur freight line moved more than freight. Men paid for locked wagons. Falls manifests. Quiet crossings. Gideon Vale invested in some of it. Your father drove for them twice. And something happened. Yes. He did not dress the truth up. But he did not make it cruel either. A winter transfer had gone wrong. A man who was supposed to be hidden from the law never reached the next station. Hiram saw enough to make Gideon nervous. Gideon paid enough to keep him quiet. And now I am the price. Nora said. Elias did not answer. He did not need to. Martha opened a drawer and pulled out a small cedar box. Your mother's. Nora's breath caught. Inside lay thread. Needles. Faded cloth. And the copper thimble. She picked it up. The rim still carried the tiny bent place that had cut her thumb when she was a child. Nora pressed her thumb against it. Then looked at the faint crescent scar. That mark will prove the consent form is false. Elias said. It will prove the thumbprint is false. Nora corrected. I still have to prove my answer matters. So, they wrote. One response to the court. One request to the territorial deputy about Black Spur contracts. They did not send the letters through the postal clerk. Elias found a stage driver heading to the line station before dawn. Nora placed the sealed papers into his hand herself. No one carries these for me unless he hears my voice. She said. The driver nodded. When the stage rolled out into the dark, Nora stood beside the depot and watched the red tail lamp disappear. 2 days was not much. But it was no longer nothing. By 8 in the morning, the stage depot hall was full. Not with passengers. With witnesses. Juniper Crossing had no proper courthouse. So the benches had been pushed against the walls. The ticket counter cleared. And the county judge's table set beneath the schedule board. Outside. Horses stamped in the dust. Inside. The air smelled of lamp oil. Old wood. Sweat. And paper. Nora sat at a small table beside Martha Pike. No lawyer. No father. No man speaking over her. Just the cedar box in front of her. The copper thimble inside it. And her right thumb resting flat against the table so she could feel the crescent scar in her own skin. Elias Cade stood near the back wall. Not beside her. Not in front of her. Where she could see him if she needed to. And where no one could say he was steering her words. Judge Harrow entered with the clerk. Removed his hat. and looked over the crowded room. This hearing concerns a petition filed by Mr. Gideon Vale to recognize a marriage consent form allegedly marked by Miss Nora Bell. He said. We will keep to facts. Gideon Vale's lawyer stood first. He was thin, neat, and dry as old paper. He placed the consent form on the table as if setting down truth itself. Your Honor. Miss Bell's father, Mr. Hiram Bell, acted in her interest. A consent mark was made. The agreement is witnessed. Mr. Vale asks only that a lawful promise be honored. Hiram sat behind him, face composed. Gideon Vale did not look at Nora. That told her more than if he had. Judge Harrow turned to her. Miss Bell. Your response. Nora stood. My response is that I never gave consent. The mark on that paper is not mine. A murmur moved along the walls. The lawyer smiled faintly. Convenient. Nora looked at the judge. May I ask the clerk for an ink pad? The room shifted. Judge Harrow studied her for a moment, then nodded. The clerk brought a small pad of black ink and placed it on the table. Nora opened her mother's cedar box and took out the copper thimble. My mother's, she said. When I was 9. This rim cut my thumb. It left a crescent scar near the pad. Every true mark I make carries a break here. She held up her hand. Not high. Just enough. Then she pressed her thumb into the ink and set it firmly on a clean sheet in the county register. When she lifted it, the mark showed clearly. A dark oval. And near the lower curve, a small pale break like a sliver of moon. Judge Harrow leaned forward. The clerk compared the mark to the consent paper. No break. No crescent. Not hers. The silence changed shape. Nora felt it happen. Before, the room had been waiting to see if she could defend herself. Now it was beginning to ask who had lied. Martha Pike stood and placed the wage board ledger on the table. Nora Bell is employed at my store. Martha said. Paid weekly. Room secured. No debt owed. She is not a dependent child hidden in some father's kitchen. The lawyer opened his mouth. But Judge Harrow raised one hand. Let her finish. Martha did. Then Elias stepped forward and laid a packet beside the wage ledger. Black Spur Freight Records. He said. Copies only. Enough to show Mr. Vale had business with Hiram Bell before this petition. Enough to show motive. Gideon's face went hard. Old freight gossip. No. Nora said. Old freight paper. She turned to the judge. My father did not make this arrangement for my protection. Mr. Vale did not file this petition because I promised him marriage. That false mark was made to turn me into silence. For the first time, Hiram looked at her like he did not recognize the woman standing there. Good. Maybe he had never truly met her before. The depot door opened. The stage driver from the line station stepped in. Dust on his coat. Followed by a woman wearing a deputy marshal's badge. She introduced herself as Clara Madsen and handed Judge Harrow Nora's letter. Stamped, received before dawn. I cannot speak to this marriage form. The deputy said. But Black Spur Freight Line is under territorial review. Mr. Vale's name appears in related records. I request the forged consent paper be held as evidence. The lawyer sat down. Gideon Vale stared at the table. Judge Harrow picked up the false consent form. Then the true thumbprint. This court will not recognize a consent that fails under its own mark. He said. The petition is dismissed. The document is void and will be held for investigation. Nora did not move. Not because she was weak. Because freedom, when it finally entered a room, did not always feel like shouting. Sometimes it felt like standing still while the cage door opened. The next morning, Juniper Crossing woke to a new notice on the county board. Judge Harrow had written it in a plain hand. No marriage consent by mark alone shall be accepted without spoken confirmation before the clerk and one female witness. People stood before it in small groups, reading slowly, as if the words had to travel farther than their eyes. Nora read it once. Then again. It did not give back every frightened year in her father's house. It did not erase the broken birdcage on the church steps, or the false thumbprint, or the sound of men discussing her future like freight to be moved before weather changed. But it put a lock on one door they had used against her. That mattered. Hiram Bell was made to sign a statement before the clerk. Not an apology. Not mercy. A record. Nora Bell did not consent to marriage with Gideon Vale. No guardianship claim, household claim, or family authority claim shall be filed on her behalf by Hiram Bell. His hand shook when he signed. Nora watched without satisfaction. She had thought victory would feel warmer. Instead, it felt like putting down a heavy bucket after carrying it too long. Relief. Yes. But also the ache left in the arms. Gideon Vale was taken for questioning by Deputy Clara Madsen. He did not argue in the street. Men like him rarely spent outrage where silence might still serve them. But the forged consent paper went with the deputy, sealed in red wax. And so did the black spur copies Elias had carried. For the first time, Nora saw paper leave town working for her instead of against her. Martha Pike gave her the corner of the dry goods store by the front window. Too much sun in the morning, Martha said. Good place for ink to dry. By the end of the week, a small desk stood there. Elias sanded the legs. Edna Lark brought a straight-backed chair. The stage driver who had carried Nora's letter nailed a narrow shelf above it. Nora hung the copper thimble from a short length of repaired bell cord. Then she wrote the sign herself. Signature desk, contracts, read. Marks witnessed. Copies kept. The first person to sit there was a girl from the laundry with a wage paper folded into a square so tight it had nearly torn at the corners. Nora did not ask who had frightened her. She only opened the paper, smoothed it flat, and read every line aloud. The paper said the girl owed 3 weeks of work for a dress she had never bought. Nora copied the line. Then she asked, "Did you agree to this?" The girl shook her head. Nora turned the paper around. "Then you do not mark it. You mark the statement instead." When the girl made her true mark, Nora watched carefully. Then she gave her a copy. "Keep this where no one else can find it," Nora said. The girl held the page like it was more than paper. Maybe it was. 3 days later, the laundry owner crossed out the false debt and paid the girl what he owed. He did not come to the desk himself. He sent the coins in a cloth purse with no note. Nora recorded that too. The wrong, the correction, both mattered. Days later, Elias took Nora north to the parcel by the cottonwoods. The grass was dry and gold. The creek ran thin but steady. He unfolded the boundary sketch and handed her a pencil. "I bought the land," he said. Nora looked at him. He did not rush to fill the silence. He never did. "And?" she asked. "And the first line should be yours." He did not say house. He did not say wife. He did not say future as if it were already settled. Nora knelt in the grass and drew a small square near the cottonwoods. "What is that?" Elias asked. "A room with morning light," she said. "For women to read before they sign." Elias looked at the square. Then at hair. "Good place for morning light." Then he took a small wooden stake from his saddlebag and pressed it into the ground where she had drawn the first corner. Not a claim. A marker. Nora understood the difference. "When you are ready," Elias said. "We build from that line." Nora looked at the stake. Then at him. "I am ready for the line," she said. "The rest can come honest." He nodded. "That is the only way I want it." Autumn came to Juniper Crossing with dust, apples, and colder evenings. The church bell rang again after Elias spliced the cord properly. Its sound carried clean across the depot. the dry goods store. And the road where Nora had once thought running was the only form of freedom. One evening, a young woman stepped into Martha's store, with a folded contract in her hand. Nora looked up from the desk. The girl swallowed. "I was told to sign this before supper. Do you want to read it alone?" Nora asked. "Or do you want me to sit beside you?" The girl stared at her. Then slowly sat. Nora moved the lamp closer. She opened the ledger and wrote the girl's name at the top of a fresh page. Then she dipped the pen again and added one line beneath it. "No mark taken until the woman understands the words." She signed below it. Nora Bell. Witness by choice. Behind her, the copper thimble caught the lamplight. On the county register, her true thumbprint remained dark and clear. Crescent scar and all. Not a mark made for her. A mark made by her. And from that day forward, in Juniper Crossing, no woman's future fit quietly beneath another man's thumb. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.